Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar sponsored by the Alliance for Water Efficiency and the California Water Efficiency Partnership. Today's topic will be rates and water conservation, what you need to know. This webinar is going to be 60 minutes in length. We plan to leave ample time for questions, so we're very happy to have you let us know what your questions might be as we go along. The audio is through your telephone or through your computer, microphone, and speakers. Not both at the same time, just one or the other. If you're hearing my voice, you have already figured this out, so I think you're good to go. But as we have done in the past, we have muted the webinar phone line because we're recording it. One of the reasons we record the webinars is so that those of you who were not able to join us during the actual time period of the webinar broadcast can look at the webinar afterwards at your leisure. So in order to keep the recording clean and clear, we mute the phone line to make sure that coffee cup noises and paper rustling and folks coming in to visit you in the office and talking to you are not part of the recording background. We've learned that kind of the hard way through our webinar process. So we do record them, we post them on our website, and you'll be able to go in and take a look at it at any time. But even though your phone line is muted, your questions can be answered. What we'd like you to do is type in your questions through the webinar dialog box. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should see an orange rectangular box with a white arrow in it. And if you click it, it will open up a dialog box where you can type in your questions as we go along throughout the webinar. Our process is to take the questions in the order that they were received at the end of the speaker presentations. And so we'll be happy to answer your questions. We usually are able to deal with nearly all of them before the end of the hour. We might go a few minutes over if you have a lot of questions. And if we do have an enormous number that we can't cover in a little bit longer than, say, 70 minutes or so, we will answer your questions by email subsequently. So do type in your questions as they occur to you. It will be part of our process in helping get you involved. So today we are very pleased to announce that we have Tom Chestnut, who is going to talk to you about a study he recently completed in Los Angeles, and Bill Christensen of the Alliance for Water Efficiency, who will talk with you about tools that we have on the Financing Sustainable Water website. In addition to myself, Mary Ann Dickinson, I'm kind of the web moderator, so my role is going to be a little more ministerial here, but I'm very happy to have our two speakers on this webinar. This is going to be a great session talking about the issues of rates, revenue stability, and conservation. So what are we going to try to cover today? First part of the webinar will cover an overview of the conservation rates and revenue issue, how they're connected, what influences the other, and how that affects you and your utility. Part two will be a discussion of how conservation and efficient water rates kept bills lower in Los Angeles, California. And it'll go through a study. Tom Chestnut was the author of the work that you'll hear described, which was a joint project of the Alliance for Water Efficiency and the California Water Efficiency Partnership. So it's a great study, and you'll hear about that from Tom. And then part three will be Bill talking about helpful resources and tools for our members on rates and conservation. He'll talk about what's on the Financing Sustainable Water website, as well as what our water conservation tracking tool can show you in terms of changes in revenue requirement and bills. So at this point, I think I'd like to turn it over to Tom, who will open up our discussion and lead us through part one.
Thank you, Mary Ann. This is Tom Chestnut. I wanted to start with a look at some of the terms that have been thrown around: conservation, rates, water use efficiency. Conservation to some people means conserving water behind the dam. To other people, conservation is any reduction in the human consumption of water. I think both of those have failings and can lead to kind of an unbalanced approach to water resources. So I'm giving a conceptual outline of how these concepts integrate, in particular, how water use efficiency, so I'm reading conservation as water use efficiency, has two components, one in the short term and one in the long term. Short-term conservation has often been thought of solely as drought management. That's included as the third box to the right here. But it also needs to include ongoing efficiency. So this means planning the financing for not only needed water efficiency, but needed not only water infrastructure, but also needed water efficiency. Financial planning also needs to include efficiency pricing. This is where the water rates tell customers how valuable the water is, and you can be too high or too low there. We also have a set of concepts for long-term conservation that include planning for water use efficiency as a water resource investment option, designing, funding, and implementing water use efficiency programs, thinking of water use efficiency as an information good. So this includes public information standards, ordinances, and new construction code, and then how water use efficiency can contribute to other goals of the utility. These concepts are found in a very helpful report from the Water Research Foundation that I was involved with, and I think they're worth a look. Next slide. So let's see, next slide. There we go. I'm also going to attempt to point people to some of the tools that Bill Christensen will get to explain later on, including this report on building better water rates for an uncertain world. Some of these are technical problems, how you do a better job or a worse job, and you can address those with technical solutions. So I urge people who are checking into the webinar to also check into Financing Sustainable Water and downloading this PDF. Next slide. So there's a key economic logic that flows through all of this. Water systems are designed, it takes costs to implement them that have to be paid for through water rates and charges, which in turn have an effect on customer demand, which connects to what kind of system you ought to design. So this economic logic flows through a lot of planning for water resources. Next slide, how do water utilities address the different things that need to be done? Well, you need to be very clear about what the ends are. What are you looking to accomplish? Key among them is often reliable delivery of quality water. Often the ends of a water utility don't stop there. They may include additional water services, handling of wastewater, stormwater, or even watershed management. Then you need to look at the financial means that utilities have to achieve those ends, including cost recovery in the short term, because if you don't recover your costs, you won't be financially viable and can't go forward as a viable utility. Resource efficiency, both in the short term and long term, and fiscal sustainability, which is a topic that GFAO has written on. Next slide. So the challenge of designing better rates, especially in an uncertain world, how do we do that? What information could lead to designing better water rates? I have a short list here. Customer consumption variability. How does weather make your customer demand vary? How does an external shock like a recession affect customer consumption? What happens if there's a supply curtailment? This is the kind of information you need to build into how you design water rates. Demand response. If I change rates, what will happen to customer demand, volume, and revenue? That appears to me to be an important thing to know because it's not certain, and we can do a better job of predicting that. Drought pricing. How do I plan for water rates under the contingency of drought and shortage occurrences? And it turns out that this is also a technical problem that can be approached technically, and we strongly recommend that drought pricing be included in any drought or shortage management plan. Probability management, what is the likelihood of a deficit? Because that can affect which rate structure will be desirable. Fiscal sustainability, what are those likelihoods over a longer time period than just 1 year out? And affordability, can your customers afford the water service? This is a topic that's received a great deal more attention, needed attention in the last few years, in no part due to the increasing cost of water. Next slide. I have seen conservation be thought of as a problem. This was a recent editorial in the journal AWWA. And it appears that conservation has momentum, and that's a big problem because your utility revenue is directly related to volume, meaning as water demand falls, so does the money coming in. I would probably contest that. I think any rate structure is not stable for lots of reasons, and it's important to understand those reasons, and we just got through mentioning many of them. The other conclusion here that worried me more is one approach to stabilizing revenue is for utilities to shift their rate structures, increasing the fixed proportion of bills. Is that a good idea? That's often the first thing that is thought of, but are there any side effects, including affordability or politics? When you have customers on a fixed income, when you increase the fixed proportion of the bill, then there's less they can do to reduce their water bill. And low-income customers, the same logic applies. Are there other ideas? What is the suite of things you need to consider? So there will be, I wrote a letter to the editor about this, and we may see in November pointing to what can help here. So next slide. Better rate practices can really help avoid any revenue surprises. There's not a single objective. It's not merely cost recovery. You also need to accomplish other things. And it's only by focusing on a complete analysis of what all the trade-offs are that you can make informed choices. So for example, the thought that I can solve my cost recovery problem by making all customer bills 100% fixed. Well, by definition, you may think that has zero revenue variability, but you'll also discover a political demand response to that. Some people may not keep their jobs for very long. 100% fixed customer bills are immensely unpopular, and for good reasons. So this is a key concept in the Financing Sustainable Water that Bill Christensen will talk more about, but we're going to be looking for the sweet spot of solutions that are not only feasible, but also effective. Next slide. So I now get to talk about what the payoff is to doing a good job with conservation programs, with efficient water rates, with supporting customers and how they can better handle the increasing cost of water, which has been going up at about twice the general rate of inflation for the last several decades. That's water and wastewater. So it's not an isolated phenomenon. This is a case study set in the city of Los Angeles. that is available, should be available on the AWE website, and was sponsored by the California Water Efficiency Partnership and the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and has other funders in here. So I appreciate all the help and support I got from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and the California Department of Water Resources. Next slide. So just to set this, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power serves over 4 million people. It has a very large service area, almost 500 square miles. It has over 7,000 miles of main, 700,000 service lines, more than 100 pressure zones, pump stations, it's a huge service area. So this is not a small problem we're talking about. Next slide. Los Angeles also has a history, a long history of implementing water conservation that goes back to the 70s. You also saw Los Angeles was instrumental in launching the early efficient toilet rebate programs at a very large scale, in part in response to a drought at the time, but also driven by other cost factors, including constraints at their wastewater facilities. They have multiple reasons, good reasons for doing this and investing in conservation programs. That has continued since the 90s, implementing California-friendly turf rebates in 2009, and the drop program, outreach program started in 2015, where the turf rebates were massively scaled in response to another drought emergency, and then implementing a rate reform for increasing block rates in 2016. And we're actually going to use some of the analytics from that rate reform that looked at what the marginal cost of water supply was. And we're going to use that to put a price tag on the value of all the investments that have been made since the early 90s. Next slide. So if you look at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power demand and population has been going up pretty continuously, seeing pretty steady growth until it's over 4 million now. You have not seen that one-to-one relationship between water demand and population growth, which is very interesting. So I was actually looking at this and inspired by Peter Mayer, who's thought about this long and hard too. We can divide demand by population, and that comes up with per capita demand. But the one question is, well, when did they stop going in a one-to-one relationship? And what if that hadn't happened? What if in the 90s, you could argue prior to that there was growth in population and growth in demand? Certainly not thereafter. What would have happened if per capita demand, if conservation had never happened and per capita demand were constant? Next slide. So this gets at our study purpose. What would have happened to water demand and then the cost to provide for that demand in the city of Los Angeles in the absence of efficiency-oriented water rates and conservation programs? The paper I wrote presents a technical estimation of the economic benefit of conservation efforts over the last 20 years through an avoided marginal cost to value those savings. So we're going to put a price tag on the value of the saved water by what it would have cost us had we not saved it. Here we can see some of the approaches that have been done, including the large-scale rebate programs in Los Angeles and also their California-friendly program encouraging sustainable and water-friendly front yards. So next slide. The punchline here is that saving water saves money. And here I have the favorite little piggy bank at the city of Los Angeles, which saves this water up. And we're going to put a price tag on all this water they've saved. Next slide. To break down what steps were involved in this study, we first estimated water demand at a constant per capita level. So we're pretending that there's no conservation. And then we're going to look at what the actual water demand was on its historic path, which we know we've observed decreasing per capita. We look at what, in the short run, what would it have cost us to provide for that additional water demand? So there's additional chemical cost and pumping cost. Energy is a big component of that. And the short run is one subset of the cost. But then we also need to look at what costs we would have incurred to provide that demand in terms of the additional water supply. So we'll talk about exactly how we put a price tag on that. The city of Los Angeles did not assume it would be able to import any additional water, and in the original implementation of increasing block rates in the early 1990s pinned their upper tier to the price of recycled water. So that has continued since then. That is the option that they believe they can access and have very good knowledge of the cost. Lastly, we're going to assess the impact on water revenue requirements and rates with and without conservation. For the geeks in the crowd, this is a partial equilibrium analysis. Next slide. So let's look at what projected constant per capita demand would look like. Here we are going to take kind of this high point of demand, and over almost decade-long period of 180 gallons per capita per day. And we're going to pretend that that adhered for the entire going forward period. Next slide. And this is the result when we look at what demand would have been had per capita demand remained constant. We have the red line as opposed to the blue line. And you may think this is not a massive amount, but at the very end, it looks pretty sizable, and it accumulates over time. And there are costs that are attached to providing that additional water service. Next slide. What might those costs be? Well, we had an analysis done of what the marginal costs were to provide all the different functional costs in water service. And this is taken directly from the rate report in July 2015, the estimated marginal cost. But we do want to note that not all of these costs apply to our question, because, for example, many of the distribution costs would remain. We're assuming there are just as many meters. It's only the water use per capita that changed and was constant. So there's only a subset of these that apply to our case in point. Next slide. And so we exclude many of these costs, and instead of $9, if we look at just the short-run marginal cost for O&M, operations and maintenance for supply, we look at the long-run marginal supply cost taken from the marginal cost of recycled water, cost of pumping locally, and then the short-run cost of water purification, the O&M. We come up with $4.25 per unit. We can then separate that into its constituent components, which are short run and which are long run. But this forms a price tag for every 100 cubic feet. And AFY is acre feet per year. So the paper will give you the conversion for all of this. Next slide. So to estimate the impact, we apply the short run avoided cost and the long run cost to this delta decrement in demand, the demand difference. We can sum that over the entire period. We sum up what the revenue was over that period to look at what how much bills were reduced. We get this price tag of 7 billion, 7.7 billion with a B dollars over that 27-year period, which if we wish to convert to a percentage is over 26% of what revenue actually was over that period. Bills would have been 26.7% higher. We can also ask what that 7.7 accrued over time would be if it were expressed in present value. So the time adjusted value is 11 billion. So this is the punchline to all of the 27 years of efforts to reduce water consumption, all of the work that went into the conservation programs, the support for reform of plumbing code and construction codes, to the efficient water rate reform that was first implemented in the early 90s and updated a couple of times since then. So next slide, we will summarize this. We can look at the 26.7% bill reduction as resulting from the costs that were avoided by all these water savings. And these water savings that were induced from intentional water rates and programs. So this is a very conscious and explicit choice that a lot of effort went into over that 27-year period. The present value of $11 billion is the cumulative benefit. Note that our savings analysis only looked at the potable water side. We did not examine wastewater or stormwater cost, which over much of the country are slightly above or slightly below water cost. As a crude measure, those savings could double were we to include the wastewater stormwater side. So these marginal cost principles have provided both a means and a method to achieve sustainable water use. That is my summary, and it's important to keep this price tag on saved water produced by intentional conservation in mind. Now I'm going to take the question of what you can do to bring this about, what tools are available, and turn that question over to Bill Christensen.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom, for that great presentation. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. And I also want to point out that his report and a fact sheet are available for download on the CalWEP website, the AWE website, and also Financing Sustainable Water. So I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about resources available to AWE and CalWEP members so they can look at these things for their service area related to rates and water conservation. And this will focus primarily on financing sustainable water. And then I want to take a look at our water conservation tracking tool and show you some of the inputs and outputs related to the topic at hand today. So on this slide, we see our Financing Sustainable Water resources. If you visit that website, you can download a free copy of the AWE handbook, Building Better Rates in an Uncertain World, which Tom talked about a bit. as well as the AWE sales forecasting and rate model. There are also some great communications tools on that website that you can download. And there are 2 videos that really portray the message of the value of water and also address the issue of how water conservation can help keep bills lower over time. So they're very concise, great for customers to look at and better understand the relationship between rates and water conservation and bills. Next slide, please. So why did AWE of all organizations build a rate model? It's common, as Tom alluded to, for rate models to assume that future sales are known with certainty and do not respond to things like price, weather variability, change in the economy, or supply shortages due to things like drought. So this is not the world we live in. The rate model allows users to evaluate customer consumption variability from these things, as well as demand response to price. So it has price elasticities built into the model. It also allows the user to develop drought pricing, so rates during various stages of drought that can be part of their contingency plans. It allows the user to simulate the performance of rates over time to understand how they can be affected by uncertainty. And it includes a 5-year time horizon, so you can look at your fiscal sustainability over time. Over on the right side of this slide, we're looking at a screen capture of the home screen for the rate model. And Tom also mentioned it addresses affordability with an affordability index calculation and looks at your current rates versus what you're proposing and evaluating in terms of a rate change and how that might affect affordability. So in regard to the rate model, if you could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to show one of the outputs from the rate model that sets it apart from other rate models. So here we're looking at a simulation distribution that includes 1,000 trials. And so here, instead of getting a single output or a single estimate for sales, we're seeing a range of possible outcomes and their likelihoods. So just to give you more information about what we're looking at, the red bars are the current rates and the green bars are proposed rates. And so for each one of those scenarios, we're seeing a range of possible outcomes for sales revenue. And if you go to the next slide, please, I'm going to switch over and talk about the tracking tool. And so many people on the webinar are probably familiar with the tracking tool. It's an Excel-based model that can be used to plan and evaluate water conservation programs. It's a resource available to AWE and CalWEP members. You have to be a member to gain access to the tracking tool. And here we're looking at a picture of the home screen. We do have a webinar on the AWE YouTube channel that's dedicated to the tracking tool if you're interested in it and you want to see all of the features. Today, I just want to focus on some of the features related to what we're talking about in terms of rates and revenue and the impacts of conservation programs. So if you go to the next slide, please. And I just want to talk about some of the key financial inputs into the tracking tool so you can get an idea of the things you put into the model. And then I'll go through some of the outputs related to our topic today. So you enter customer average volumetric water rates is one of the key inputs. And you also enter other utility rates that are used to calculate benefits on the customer side. We also enter utility avoided costs. So we enter variable costs, as well as any long-run costs related to capacity expansion. And in one of the next slides, I'll show you the avoided cost calculator where you do that. You also enter information about conservation program costs. Those are critical too in the analysis. Conservation programs aren't free. There are things like startup costs to get the programs going, cost per widget or device. So if you're doing a rebate, what's that variable cost for every participant in your program. There are also staffing and administrative costs. If you're administering a rebate, you're not just going to incur that cost. There's also that staff time to process it. And then there are inputs for overhead if you want to include things like marketing for your conservation program. And then also a key financial input is your conservation program savings. How much water do you expect to save with your conservation program? The tracking tool does come with some estimates for various programs, but that is a key input. And as Tom mentioned, saving water saves money. So next slide, please. So here we are looking at the avoided cost calculator that comes built in with the tracking tool. So one of the key things we're talking about today are costs that we can avoid with water conservation. And this is a critical input sheet in the tracking tool. The user does have the flexibility to enter their own avoided cost estimates if they've done an avoided cost study. But if not, the tracking tool comes with a built-in calculator. And so I'd like to draw your attention to the cells with yellow highlight, and that's where the user enters data or information into the tracking tool. And here we're looking at an example where this utility purchases wholesale water at a price of $1,050 per acre foot. They also entered data related to the energy cost per acre foot, which is $80. So their total variable cost is around $1,100 per acre foot. So that's the cost they could avoid by saving water. If you look lower on this sheet, there's an input related to water system capacity expansion. So if a utility is up against their current peak season capacity and they think they're going to exceed that into the future, they can implement water conservation programs to avoid that and really save large amounts of money by implementing conservation programs. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the average water rate in a baseline condition and then condition with water conservation programs. The water conservation programs are shown in two ways. That's the red and green bars, and that's pay-as-you-go financing, and then also with debt financing. So the blue bar is the baseline condition with no conservation programs. And you can see rates are going up over time, whether or not there's conservation, and that's just because of natural escalation rates. Then we can look at the dynamic if we pay for our conservation programs out of current revenues or if we debt finance them, what that might look like. And rates may go up, but if you go to the next slide, we can also gain insight into what will happen to our bills. So our average customer bills on the volumetric side is what's being shown on this slide. And this can be a critical output for users that want to evaluate conservation programs and the financial impacts, not only to the utility, but also to the customers. So this is a similar slide as to what we just looked at, but it has bills rather than rates. And we can see what the effect would be if we pay as we go or if we debt finance our programs. Next slide, please. This chart shows very similar effects, but it presents it in a different manner. So before we were looking at the actual average volumetric bill values, and here we're looking at the change based on the conservation program effects. So here we've got the red bars, which are pay-as-you-go financing, and then the green bars, which are debt financing. So this is just showing what the average monthly volumetric bill change would be. And we can see with pay-as-we-go, the bills would increase in those upfront years as we're coming up with revenue to pay for our conservation programs. But then over time, the effect of the bills is that they go down. So investing in cost-effective water conservation programs actually lowers customer bills over time.
So Bill, let me jump in for a minute.
Yeah,
I wanted to mention that this is a great chart in the AWE tracking tool for anyone working with conservation programs to be able to have a conversation with the folks in the finance department. This really helps get everyone on the same page, and I think it's important. If you have a cost-ineffective conservation program, your bills will be higher. So this is the exact chart for cost-effective conservation, which helps get everyone get on the same page. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for chiming in. That's a great message. And then if you could go to the next slide. Now we're looking at the change in annual volumetric revenue requirement. And this chart probably looks very familiar because it's essentially identical to the change in volumetric bills, because those bills would change in step to make up for the volumetric revenue requirement changes. And as Tom mentioned, these charts are there for you not only to gain insight into the effect of your conservation programs, but can also be an amazing communication tool to talk to other folks in your agency, the finance department, and to communicate to customers to show that they're better off with these cost-effective water conservation programs. And so Tom alluded to the cost effectiveness, and that does matter. So if you could click to the next slide. One of my favorite sheets in the tracking tool is the utility costs and benefits sheet, where the value of the benefits are presented as well as the costs for each conservation program, and then also the conservation portfolio as a whole. So if you look at the top of this slide, we see the benefit cost ratios for all these programs are very positive. These are very cost-effective programs. And then if we look to the chart to the right that shows the change in average monthly volumetric bill, it's what we were looking at earlier, where these cost-effective programs will have lower bills out into the future. So over time, bills will go down because we are investing in cost-effective water conservation programs. If we look at the chart on the bottom, we see that a lot of the programs are not cost-effective, and that's indicative of the red type, which the tracking tool automatically formats if you have a program that's not cost-effective. And then if we look at the change in monthly volumetric bills with those programs that are not cost-effective, we see that bills go up over time. And that's regardless of whether you're paying as you go or debt financing those programs. So this really illustrates that it's critical to have your programs be cost-effective. And it's also critical to look at your programs themselves and the effect they're going to have on things like rates, revenue, and water bills. If you think back to the chart we looked at from the rate model, our demand had a range of outcomes and different likelihoods. And sometimes water conservation can be blamed for missing things like revenue targets. And if we really look at our conservation programs closely and the effects they'll have financially, we'll gain better insight into what's really going on. And AWE's tools through the rate model and the tracking tool allows our members to really dig in and understand those effects. So the rate model is available on the Financing Sustainable Water website, and the AWE tracking tool can be requested from the AWE site. And if you'd like to learn more about it, there's some information on our website as well as the webinar that I mentioned. And we will have time for questions, but I know many of you will also be at the Water Smart Innovations Conference. So if you're there and you want to talk about any of this, please feel free to pull me aside and we can chat about it. But that's what I have, and now we have about 15 minutes for questions.
So thank you very much, Tom and Bill, for two great presentations. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will post a link for the webinar recording and also a PDF of the webinar presentation in a few days after we've cleaned up the recording and getting it together on YouTube. We post it on YouTube, but we also have a link to that recording on our website. If you go to the Alliance for Water Efficiency website under the resource library, there's an AWE webinars tab in the drop-down menu, and it lists all of those webinars, and this one will be the most recent. But we want to make sure that you mark your calendar for our next webinar, which is going to be held in conjunction with US EPA on October 11th. We will be featuring the topic of reducing outdoor water use with micro-irrigation. And again, this is a partnership webinar that we do with the EPA WaterSense program. And if you go to our webpage or to the WaterSense webpage, you'll be able to register for that webinar. And so I think at this point we're ready for additional questions. And Liam will read questions as they've come in. If we don't get to your question, or if you think of a question after the presentation is over and the webinar is over, you can feel free to email Liam at that email address, and we'll take care of answering those questions for you. So at this point, Liam, what questions do we have so far?
Thanks, Marianne. Okay, first question. Do you assume that LA's conservation efforts caused all of the conservation? Any idea how much might have occurred if LA hadn't made any conservation efforts?
So that is a broad question in causality, and I want to own up that, as with most questions of causality, we can't answer that definitively. I will point out that the city of Los Angeles was very active in bringing about the change in plumbing codes, supporting legislation to do that, and if that it's an open question if the city of Los Angeles had not teamed up with others to support that, whether the changes to the plumbing code would have happened at all. And I suppose you could argue it one way or the other. As it is, we do know that Los Angeles does have differential savings from other cities, and even in Southern California, due in no small part to all of their intentional efforts. So I'm quite sure that there are people that could get tenure getting into this question about how much was caused and what the additional increment was. As it is, I think this thought experiment is really quite valuable. I also think it's kind of a conservative price tag in that there are alternative ways that you could have come up with a higher avoided cost. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think it's a key question and one that reasonable people can disagree on.
Okay, next question. The cumulative savings were $11 billion. What was the cost of the conservation program implementation during the study's time horizon?
Let's see. I have not done that calculation, but I can provide some assurance that it is vastly less than $11 billion in net present value. So even in a maximal year of conservation programs, and I'm thinking expenditures in the 2015 drought emergency, collectively they didn't break, what was it, 500 million? In any case, much less. That's a cool question. I may put that to the analysts at the Department of Water and Power and see if they have a compilation of conservation programmatic expenditures over time. Great question.
Okay. On Bill's last slide, many of the outdoor conservation methods were not cost effective. Could you discuss why?
That is a great question. I should have mentioned this during my presentation, that those results should be considered arbitrary. So it was to demonstrate that if you have programs that are not cost effective, that bills will in fact go up. So the focus was on the functionality of the tracking tool rather than having a specific conservation program not be cost effective. That said, different programs have different unit costs, if you will, in terms of how much water they will save for your investment. Um, but that is to say also that this is not an evaluation of conservation programs. So what I did was take the exact same scenario, if you look at that slide on the top and the bottom, and change the costs of the programs uh, to essentially make them not cost effective for purposes of illustration. So good question, but nothing in particular that made them not cost effective.
Okay, next question. Does water conservation make sense in other states of the country? Is it only required for states which face drought?
Oh, that's an awesome question. So this actually follows nicely on to the previous question. Whether a program is cost effective or not depends on the setting. So Bill Christensen illustrated that if your avoided costs are different, programs that were previously cost effective may not be if your avoided costs are very low. And you will see differences in those avoided costs that do vary across the country. That said, many areas of the country that are not thought of as being short of water still have fairly expensive water. And there are a lot of cost drivers behind water service, potable water service in particular. Customers place a big premium on having a high quality to the water that they drink and bathe and shower in. And they have very high expectations there that are not always met everywhere. Similarly, areas that have no droughts may have constraints on their wastewater. So that has been a huge cost driver in some of the older cities on the eastern seaboard and have caused the implementation of large-scale conservation programs there. Marianne, what's your thought on that?
Well, I completely agree that it depends on the drivers within the community. And we do often see that wastewater can be a bigger driver for conservation than water supply issues if there's excess capacity for water supply or if there's sufficient supply because of it being a more wet area on the East Coast. But wastewater treatment is often a good avoided cost driver, and I offer as Exhibit A the City of New York's program where they avoided building a new wastewater treatment plant because they implemented a large-scale toilet retrofit program. And they saved millions and millions of dollars in doing that, primarily from a wastewater-driven need. So it depends. It's going to be different for every system, and every system has to analyze, as Tom had indicated in the beginning of his presentation, what the drivers are for you for water efficiency benefits.
All right, next question. How do you quantify the importance of utility leak detection programs for the overall conservation program? Do you think the allocation of budget for leak detection is sufficient?
Ooh, that's a really good
just
question.
got a stack of great questions. So system loss control and leak detection, it's, we don't want to limit it to just finding the leaks. We want to fix them. But that's often some very, very cost-effective work that's out there, and more of it needs to be done. And the logic behind that is the exact same logic behind the water conservation programs. And in fact, in the AWE water conservation tracking tool, there's a spot for distribution system loss control. So it can actually be ranked in exactly the same way. I think the key thing is having a better understanding of the cost. I've always found it interesting that at every energy utility, there is a production costing model, and they have an intimate understanding of it and can talk about it in detail. If you walk into many water utilities and ask where the production costing model is, you often get blank stares. So I think understanding what the cost drivers are and which costs you can avoid and which ones you can't, that's going to be critical to doing a better job at delivering reliable water service.
Okay. Next question. How do we address the fact that so many utility costs are fixed?
So I tend to view that like the weather. You can complain about it, but it won't change it. This is a fact about the water industry, the high preponderance of fixed cost. And much of the water infrastructure has long lives, so there's a much higher proportion of fixed cost in water than in other utility services, networked utility services. That said, we also need to note that fixed is not a unitary concept. So something is fixed for the coming year, but you can affect it over the long term. So to abuse John Maynard Keynes' quote, in the long run, we're all dead. But the concept of fixedness, it's actually a quality, fixity. You can define how fixed a cost is, and the only way to define that is specifying the time period. So there's certain costs that are fixed, and a whole bunch of them are fixed in the next year. But if you start looking out 3 to 5 years out, more of those costs, you may be able to push them out, defer them, if not completely avoid them. And that's key to the whole cost minimization challenge facing water utilities. And given the increasing cost of water infrastructure, that's going to be all the more important to take very seriously. Mary Ann, any thoughts?
So, yeah, I would love to weigh in on this one. Yes, probably 80% of most utilities costs are fixed and 20% are variable, but the revenue picture is usually 20% fixed and 80% variable in terms of the way we structure our rates. That doesn't mean we should flip it and make a fixed cost 80% to match the fixed costs that you actually see. That's a very dangerous trend. Tom talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the webinar. And I offer as an example of how you don't need to have a high fixed charge, I offer as Exhibit A, the City of Los Angeles that has no fixed charge in their rate structure. It's 100% volumetric billing. And they are often asked, well, how do you cover your fixed costs? And they say, we have had historical records where we know very, very clearly how much revenue we can collect any year from our customer base. You have a good indication. If you look at those revenue statistics, you know how much you consistently raise over the course of weather variability and changes in drought stage or any other economic factor. They do know what their predictable rate of return is from their customer base. So they don't need a fixed charge in order to make their fixed cost. They just make sure that their predictable, reliable revenue percentages cover those fixed costs. So I think we don't want to get into the trap of always feeling like the rate structure should mirror the exact percentages of fixed versus variable costs in the utility system.
In fact, that's not cost of service rate making. So AWWA has a great financial management and cost of service seminar. It's up to 3 days now. NARUC offers a utility rate school. So I strongly urge folks out there to invest in your human capital. These tools that the Alliance offers are free. It's even better if folks get some training in how to use them.
Okay.
So Liam, do we have some more questions?
Just a couple more. Well, a couple folks have asked about the recording and the PowerPoint, and just to reiterate what Mary Ann said, I will be sending that out to everybody in the coming days. And then actually the last question we have is just what was the conference you mentioned at the end? So a good chance to do a last minute plug for WSI.
Yes. So the Water Smart Innovations Conference will be held in Las Vegas beginning beginning Tuesday of next week and running through Friday. It is the annual convening of water conservation professionals. As many as 1,000 water conservation professionals gather for this annual conference to share results of research, program experiences, and issues of the day. There are multiple tracks. I think it's sometimes as many as 8 tracks of papers on various topics. So it's a really well put together conference that's run by the Southern Nevada Water Authority. So if you just type in the Google search Water Smart Innovations Conference, you'll get to see the program and all of the information, and I'm sure they will welcome additional attendees next week. The official conference starts on Wednesday morning. Keynote speaker is Jerry Udelson talking about green building. But all day Tuesday, we will have committee meetings for the Alliance for Water Efficiency. The California Water Efficiency Partnership will have a Quell landscaper train the trainer program. So there's lots of activity that starts already on Tuesday, in addition to our AWE annual member meeting in the evening, which everyone is welcome to attend. So that's the conference that Bill mentioned. So we hope we see a number of you there.
Cheap flights and cheap rooms are still available.
That's exactly right. So, Liam, did that finish all of our questions?
Yep, we're all set.
Okay, thank you. So to just conclude, I want to again thank Dr. Thomas Chestnut and Bill Christensen from the AWE staff for a terrific set of presentations on this issue of rates and water conservation, what you need to know. And this last slide has contact information both for the Alliance for Water Efficiency office and also for the California chapter office in Sacramento. So please feel free to contact us. We are here to help you with your water conservation needs. So thank you very much for attending this webinar, and we look forward to working with you in the future.